Some truths burn not in fire, but in the quiet refusal to be spoken. Tonight's mystery begins with a torn confession, a vanished man, and a daughter who never knew the weight of her own surname. In a London veiled by frost and silence, Holmes uncovers a secret that justice itself dared not claim. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. The hour is late, the snow has fallen, and Holmes is already watching from the window. Let's walk beside him and listen. It was on a morning of peculiar stillness, one of those grim London dawns in which the fog hangs low over the city like a mourner's veil, that I returned to Baker Street after several days at my Kensington practice. The lamps along the thoroughfare still burned weakly against the pale light, and the chill in the air was enough to drive even the most determined pedestrian indoors. When I ascended the familiar steps and entered our sitting room, I found Holmes standing by the hearth, a thin plume of smoke rising from the grate and curling around his tall figure like a wraith. He did not turn at the sound of my entrance, nor offer the usual dry remark with which he was wont to greet me. Instead, his attention was fixed upon the charred remnants of a letter that lay in the fireplace, its edges curling into ash while its centre remained stubbornly intact. A faint smell of scorched paper lingered in the room, mingling with the odour of stale tobacco and the faint hint of winter dampness that had crept in from the street. "You're early," he murmured without turning. "And fortunate, perhaps. I am in need of a mind unclouded by politics or prejudice." "Good morning to you too, Holmes," I replied, removing my gloves. "And may I ask what has reduced your morning correspondence to cinders?" Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not correspondence, Watson. A summons, of a kind most peculiar." He drew the fire tongs delicately from the grate and lifted from the embers a half-burnt envelope. Its wax seal blackened but still discernible. The parchment, though scorched at the edges, bore a faint monastic insignia and, in a hand that trembled even in ink, the name, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street, London. "The letter arrived by post yesterday," Holmes said, setting the remains on the table. "But it did not come from any government office or titled widow. As is often the case, it came from Greyfriars Priory in Surrey, a place where the world is supposed to be forgotten." "A religious house?" I asked, intrigued. "Indeed. Benedictine, I believe. The man who wrote it calls himself Brother Caleb." He passed me a folded page, salvaged from the heart of the letter. Its margins singed, but the contents still legible. The ink was faded but legible, and the hand, though stiff, conveyed urgency. The monk implored Holmes to come at once. "A matter of conscience," it said. "A sin long buried, a confession that could not die with the confessor." "It was thrown into the fire," Holmes observed quietly, "but not by my hand." "You believe someone attempted to destroy it before it reached you?" "No," Holmes said, settling into his armchair. "I believe the sender changed his mind." There followed a long silence in which Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin and stared into the fire, as though the answer might rise again with the smoke. At length, he said, "Brother Caleb is not his true name. His real name is Arthur Selwyn." The name did not immediately stir memory, but Holmes, seeing my hesitation, continued. "Selwyn was a solicitor of considerable repute in the 1870s, known for his eloquence and discretion. In 1877, his name surfaced in connection with a political bribery scandal involving railway concessions. He was never tried. He vanished before he could be questioned, leaving behind nothing but a coat and a walking stick found near Westminster Bridge." I sat upright. "You mean he was presumed drowned?" "Presumed, yes, but as you can see, not dead." I examined the writing again. There was a curious tension in the penmanship, as though each word had cost something to write. 20 years in hiding," I murmured. "And now he seeks you out." "Not for exoneration," Holmes said, "for absolution. The letter is clear on that point. The man is dying, Watson. And the nature of his guilt? That, Holmes replied, remains to be discovered. But if he has summoned me after 2 decades of silence, I must believe that what he carries is too heavy to be borne beyond the grave. By midday, Holmes had dispatched 2 telegrams, one to the Prior of Greyfriars, the other to Inspector Lestrade, the purpose of which he did not disclose, and instructed Mrs. Hudson to pack a small valise with essentials. I, for my part, gathered my notes and a few supplies of a medical nature, for the tone of Selwyn's letter suggested an urgency not merely spiritual. The weather, meanwhile, turned sullen. The snow which had threatened for days began to fall in soft flakes, coating the rooftops in a pale hush. As our train departed Victoria, the city receded into a slate-grey blur, and Holmes, gazing through the frost-etched window-pane, seemed lost to the motion of the landscape. "Tell me, Holmes," I said quietly, "do you expect this case to end in justice?" He did not turn to me, but his answer was immediate. "No, Watson, I expect it to end in silence, but it may be a silence that some cannot afford." There was no triumph in his tone, only the cold inevitability that I had come to know as Holmes's truest form of certainty. And as the carriage rattled forward into the white-shrouded countryside, I could not help but feel that we were not travelling merely toward a man's confession, but into the very marrow of something that had refused to die. There was something in the weary groan of the train as it made its way through the whitening countryside that struck me with a curious melancholy. The landscape of Surrey, though not wild, had taken on a solemn dignity beneath the first fall of true winter, and the heathlands, those broad, wind-scoured plains, lay pale and empty beneath a pewter-coloured sky. Our compartment was silent, but for the rhythmic thrum of the rails, and Holmes sat across from me, half shrouded in the collar of his greatcoat, his eyes unmoving from the grey blur beyond the window. He had spoken little since we left Victoria Station. Once, I had ventured to ask whether he expected resistance from the monastic order to his visit, and he had answered only, "That depends on what they fear most, scandal or truth." From the glint in his eye and the habitual tapping of his fingers, I knew the mental machinery was already hard at work. By the time the train pulled into the modest rural platform near Farncombe, the day had already begun to retreat into a bruised twilight. A hired carriage awaited us, its driver nodding in silent recognition, having no doubt been dispatched by the Priory's discreet hand. We climbed aboard, and the horses moved forward with a slow, deliberate rhythm along a narrow road lined with skeletal trees. "Note the absence of wheel tracks," Holmes murmured as we passed a broken milestone. "No visitors, no deliveries. Isolation, Watson, is the surest cloak for secrets that refuse to die." We arrived at Greyfriars just as the last of the sun's light failed against the bare limbs of the trees. The Priory stood half-sunken in the moor, its aged stone walls cloaked in ivy, and its windows giving off no light, save for one flickering lamp behind the mullioned glass of a narrow tower. A stillness hung about the grounds, not the sacred quietude of contemplation, but the brittle silence of restraint. The gates opened at our approach, as though we had been expected, and a silent novice admitted us without word or question. The air within was warmer, though tinged with the scent of damp limestone and centuries of wax-polished oak. The corridors echoed faintly with the tread of our boots upon the flagstones, and from somewhere beyond the cloisters came the gentle sound of a bell calling the monks to vespers. I could not help but recall the last time I had accompanied Holmes into such a place. Though not a priory, it had borne the same odour of hidden grief and long-buried shame. My companion walked slowly, eyes grazing over the archways and recessed alcoves, with that peculiar alertness he reserved for unfamiliar theatres. "Observe," he said softly, nodding toward a half-worn inscription carved into the lintel above the door. "Veritas liberabit vos," an admirable motto for a house built on silence. "Truth shall set you free," I translated. "Do you believe it will, in this case?" Holmes offered a dry smile. That depends on what the truth costs, my dear Watson. We were shown into a dim parlour where a single oil lamp cast long shadows across the stone walls. After a moment, a tall figure entered, stooped at the shoulders but not frail, his robes falling with austere precision around his frame. His hair was silvered and close-cropped, his face grave but composed. This was Prior Benedict, the spiritual head of Greyfriars, and there was in his bearing the calm of one who had seen many winters and perhaps weathered a few storms of the soul. "Mr. Holmes," he said, bowing slightly, "we had not anticipated your arrival so soon." Holmes returned the gesture with a subtle nod. "Your brother Caleb conveyed a sense of urgency. I have never been one to delay when a man claims his conscience burns." A flicker passed across the prior's expression, not fear precisely, but unease, keenly disguised as weariness. "I regret to inform you," he said, folding his hands, "that Brother Caleb is absent. He did not attend morning matins. His cell was empty. We have searched the grounds and made discreet inquiries, but he has not been seen since last night's vigils." Holmes' gaze remained fixed, unreadable. "And was anything of his missing?" The prior hesitated. "Nothing of significance. His robe remained folded on the cot, his sandals were at the foot of his bed, his breviary and psalter were undisturbed." Holmes looked briefly toward the lamp. "So, the body is gone, but the garments remain. Curious, is it not, how departures in this world often resemble preparations for the next?" Prior Benedict led us through the northern wing of the priory, where the monks' cells lined a narrow corridor lit only by slivers of dying daylight from high, arched windows. Brother Caleb's door was already ajar, and Holmes entered without ceremony. The room was spare to the point of severity. A wooden cot, a worn woolen blanket, a crucifix upon the wall, and a plain shelf bearing 2 volumes, both scriptural. The robe, as the prior had stated, was neatly folded at the foot of the bed, its sleeves carefully aligned. Yet Holmes's eyes were not on the robe, but the straw mattress, which had not yet cooled entirely beneath the linen. He placed a hand upon it and nodded to himself. He moved next to the narrow window, its sill streaked faintly with condensation. There, his fingers paused, brushing the stone ledge. "There is damp here, but no frost," he said. "The window was opened within the last few hours." He turned to the shelf, running his finger behind the volumes and along the joint where the wood met the wall. "No dust," he said softly. "Brother Caleb left in haste, but not without intention. He did not flee. He arranged his cell to be found precisely so." Holmes and I made our way into the cloistered walk that encircled the central court, its flagstones uneven and rimmed with frost. He knelt by one of the outer arches, his lantern sweeping gently over the stones. "There," he whispered. "The tread is light, the heel shallow. Sandals. And look, you see the slight drag in the right foot." I followed his gaze. The footprints, barely visible, moved in a curving arc toward a side door near the chapel wall. Holmes tested the latch. It opened with no resistance. He left through here, and no one thought to bolt it since. Either the monks trust too freely, or they hoped no one would think to ask. The wind pushed in gently from the night beyond. Holmes turned his gaze outward. "Let us see where silence leads, Watson." We had returned to the guest chambers that the prior, with reluctant civility, had made available to us within the priory's southern wing. The room was modest, warmed only by a narrow hearth beside which Holmes now sat, his long fingers steepled before his face, his gaze lost in the silent dance of the flames. "It is always the respectable ones," he murmured at last, as though to himself. "The men whose shoes are polished too well. They vanish more completely because they are trusted too completely." I knew better than to interrupt such musings. Holmes spoke not idly, but as a man navigating backward through a fog of dates and names, threading a path toward a truth others had chosen to forget. "Arthur Selwyn," he said after a long pause, "was a man who might have been a minister, A solicitor of immense promise, widely admired for his poise in the courtroom and discretion outside of it. Born in Kent, educated at the Inns of Court, married once, briefly, and by all accounts, a gentleman of perfect address. But what is address, Watson? If it conceals a locked drawer. He reached for the envelope we had brought from Baker Street and laid it beside him. That letter was not merely written by Brother Caleb. It was written by a man trying to exhale the weight of 2 decades in hiding. Selwyn never ceased to exist. He merely assumed a quieter name and placed himself beyond the reach of consequence. And you believe, I asked quietly, that he wishes now to be found? Holmes nodded once. Not by the law, by the truth. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the firelight casting angular shadows along the sharp lines of his face. You recall the political scandal of 1827? He asked, as though inquiring after the weather. I searched my memory. Vaguely, something to do with the railway charters, colonial freight routes and speculation? Just so, Holmes replied. And with it, the quiet disappearance of one Arthur Selwyn, whose name had begun to surface in association with 2 members of the Board of Trade and a rather large sum of unaccounted-for parliamentary funds. He drew his fingers together slowly. The Crown, under pressure from certain quarters, prepared to launch an inquiry. But on the night preceding the initial summons, Selwyn failed to return home. His walking stick was found wedged between the slats of the Westminster footbridge. His hat, floating downstream, was retrieved by a boatman. His coat turned up 2 days later, folded and dry, in the shrubbery outside a cemetery in Lambeth. There was no body? I asked. None, Holmes said flatly. And no will, no suicide note, no beneficiary. The case was quietly closed as the death of a disgraced man whose shame had bested his conscience. His name was whispered for a season in drawing rooms, then disappeared altogether. Holmes gave a slight shrug. But shame does not kill, and conscience, as we know, is not always quick. The more interesting question, Holmes resumed, is not how he vanished, but how he remained vanished for so long. I have studied men in flight, Watson. Few are capable of severing every tether, legal, social, and emotional, and yet Selwyn managed it with surgical precision. Surely he had assistance, I suggested. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. There is evidence to suggest that he was not merely fleeing justice, but was being quietly assisted in his escape. A barrister's clerk who disappeared the same week, a small banking house in Geneva that closed its ledgers inexplicably, and a travelling bishop, later disgraced, whose itinerary was curiously amended in the spring of that year. And to what end? I pressed. To silence, Watson, he said. Not the silence of a man escaping disgrace, but the orchestrated stillness of a secret worth burying. Selwyn's disappearance benefited more than himself. If he had spoken, certain names might have tumbled into ruin. I sat in thought. And now, 20 years later, he surfaces as a monk. Why reveal himself at all? Holmes's voice was quiet. Because death cares nothing for secrets, and some men, before they meet it, wish to set their souls in order. Holmes reached for the scorched letter again, this time unfolding it fully and smoothing its creases upon the table. He tapped one line lightly with his index finger. It is here, he said, in the choice of his phrasing. There are truths, Mr. Holmes, that I buried with my name. I can no longer be the grave that holds them. That is not the language of desperation, Watson. It is the language of release. And yet he disappeared before we could arrive, I said, which suggests either that he was prevented from confessing, Holmes replied, or that someone else fears the truth he was prepared to confess. His brow furrowed slightly, and he reached for a small notebook in his coat pocket. We must consider 2 possibilities. Either Selwyn has taken flight once again, prompted by guilt or fear, or he has been removed by hands more interested in the preservation of their own reputations than his redemption. He paused and looked across the firelight at me. In either case, the confession remains. Somewhere in this house of stone and silence, the truth lingers, and I intend to find it. He rose then, slowly and with a quiet purpose, as though the fire had spoken something only he had heard. The last coals hissed in the grate, and outside, beyond the thick glass, the wind pressed against the priory walls like the breath of history rising from the earth. 2 days after our arrival at Greyfriars, Holmes and I made our way back to London in pursuit of a name that had emerged not from the lips of a witness, but from a long-forgotten ledger Holmes had uncovered among Selwyn's archived legal records. The name was Verney, Judge Horace Verney, formerly of the Queen's Bench, and, it seemed, an old associate of the vanished solicitor. The judge himself had died 5 years prior, but his widow remained in residence at their Bayswater townhouse, an address Holmes had memorised before I could reach for my notebook. We arrived just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, a golden hue falling like dust across the heavy facades of the square. The house at number 23 was set back from the road, its curtains drawn, though the day was not yet done, and the ironwork of the gate had been allowed to rust in silence. A maid, small and colourless, admitted us with downcast eyes, and we were soon ushered into a drawing-room where time seemed to hang in the air like the perfume of pressed flowers. Nothing in the room had been touched in years, it seemed, not the portraits, nor the velvet cushions, nor the bone-dry piano that sat against the wall like a sealed confession. It was there that Mrs. Agatha Verney entered, her mourning black impeccable, her back straight, and her eyes, though dulled by age, holding the fire of a woman whose battles had long since turned inward. She greeted us without ceremony, her voice low and dry, like leaves turned brittle from too many winters. Holmes inclined his head respectfully, and I followed suit. The widow gestured for us to sit, but offered no refreshment, and when Holmes declined tea, she seemed relieved. "Mr. Holmes," she said at last, folding her hands in her lap, "I presume you do not come on account of my late husband's scholarship in Roman law?" Holmes offered a faint smile. "Not directly, madam. I come regarding Arthur Selwyn." Her eyelids flickered, not quite a wince, but a motion too fast to be entirely voluntary. She did not speak at once. Her gaze drifted to the fireplace, where faint embers still glowed among the coals. I followed her eyes and saw a sliver of curled parchment blackened along one edge, nestled deep in the grate. She seemed aware that we had both noticed it. "There are names," she said quietly, "which burn hotter than fire, Mr. Holmes, even after 20 years. Holmes made no reply. He simply allowed the silence to deepen, as he often did, until the weight of it pressed speech from the lips of even the most cautious witness. Mrs. Verney exhaled and looked away from the grate. "If Selwyn has found you," she said at last, "then I suppose the past is less buried than I had hoped." Holmes did not posture, nor assume his usual air of provocation. Instead, he asked gently, "May I ask when the letter arrived, madam?" Mrs. Verney's hands tensed over one another, though she kept her voice level. "Early this morning. The same seal you are no doubt familiar with. My maid placed it on the breakfast table. You recognise the handwriting?" "I recognise the weight of the envelope," she replied. "There are some correspondences which carry more than ink." "And you chose to destroy it," Holmes said, almost conversationally. She met his gaze, though her eyes shimmered faintly beneath the mantle of self-control. "I did." "Why?" The question lingered in the air for several seconds. At length she said, "Because I knew what it contained. Not the details, of course, but I knew what it must represent. Guilt, or perhaps, what is worse, truth." Holmes studied her, his fingers lightly pressed together. "Did your husband know of Selwyn's fate?" Mrs. Verney hesitated. "Horace believed him dead, as did the rest of the world, but he He kept certain papers locked in his chambers at Lincoln's Inn. There was correspondence, coded, discreet, between Selwyn and an unnamed intermediary. I discovered them only after his passing. I burned them too. Her voice faltered slightly, and when she spoke again, it was with something close to anguish. I did not burn them to protect Horace. I burned them because I could not bear to know the man I had loved had kept such things from me. Holmes inclined his head, his voice scarcely above a whisper. And yet, it is always the silence that remains. Mrs. Verney turned her face slightly away, as though the very name of Selwyn brought with it a wind she could not withstand. "My husband despised weakness in others," she said, her voice now thin, "and Selwyn's disappearance, it shamed him, not because he believed the man guilty, but because he believed him afraid." "And what do you believe?" I asked softly. Her lips trembled once, then steadied. "I believe Arthur Selwyn carried more guilt than he deserved, and that my husband carried less than he should have." Holmes gave no reaction, but I sensed in him a subtle tightening of thought, a recalibration of some internal theory not yet spoken aloud. "You are a man of evidence, Mr. Holmes," she continued, "but there are truths that cannot be found in letters or records, only in the weight they leave behind." We made our farewells in silence. Mrs. Verney did not rise from her chair, but she watched us as we left, her eyes following Holmes with a gaze that held neither malice nor warmth, only the weary resignation of one who had long ago stopped asking questions. As we passed into the corridor, and our steps echoed faintly down the marble hall, Holmes paused at the threshold and cast one final glance toward the drawing-room hearth. The fire had nearly died. "Not all ashes are innocent," he murmured, more to himself than to me. I said nothing. Outside, the cold had grown sharp, and the gas lamps along the street flickered in the wind like candles in a chapel long closed. It was well past midnight when Holmes roused me from my modest cot in the guest chamber, his voice low and sharp with purpose. A thin sliver of moonlight filtered through the narrow lancet window, and beyond the frost-glazed glass, the priory grounds lay wrapped in a silence so complete that the creak of my boots seemed a sacrilege. Holmes had already lit a small lantern, shuttered so as to throw its light only where needed, and motioned for me to follow him into the cloisters. The ancient corridors of Greyfriars seemed older still by night, their shadows thick and unmoving, as if the very stones had grown accustomed to secrets whispered over centuries and were disinclined to let them go. We moved through the vaulted arcade, our footfalls muffled by worn flags, smoothed by time and barefoot prayers. The candle in Holmes's hand bobbed like a spirit's eye in the dark, casting fleeting halos on the moss-lined walls. A faint draught moved through the passageways, stirring the hem of his greatcoat as though the very air disapproved of our intrusion. "I do not often trespass upon hallowed ground," Holmes murmured, "but I have found that the truth, like a guilty man, prefers to hide in chapels." I did not reply. In the silence, even thought felt intrusive. Somewhere beyond the transept, a bell tolled the hour, and it seemed to me that each note fell not through the air but down through the very bones of the priory. We returned to the narrow passage that housed the monks' cells, and Holmes pushed open the door to Brother Caleb's chamber without hesitation. Though I had been there once before, by daylight, it was a different place under the lamp's muted glow. Colder, starker, and somehow lonelier. The cot remained unruffled, the robe folded with the same care as before. Holmes raised the lantern and examined the crucifix nailed to the bare stone wall above the bed. Its surface was cracked with age, and the Christ figure bore the faded traces of once gilded wounds. Holmes stared at it for a moment, then turned to the shelf beside the bed, where the 2 volumes rested untouched. He drew them down, one a book of hours, the other a psalter, bound in brown leather, softened by years of touch. He laid both volumes on the cot and opened them slowly, page by page, his eyes sweeping over the margins and spines with an intensity I had come to associate with the scent of discovery. Observe, he said, lifting a page carefully. The hymnal is untouched, the edges dusted, the binding stiff. But the Psalter. He held the second volume aloft and tipped it forward. A faint rustle escaped its pages, and a single folded sheet fell to the blanket like a feather, surrendering to gravity. Brother Caleb may have fled, Holmes said, but his conscience could not follow. Holmes unfolded the parchment with delicacy, his fingers working with the same reverence a priest might show an ancient relic. It had been folded many times, and the creases bore witness to repeated hesitation. A document withdrawn, considered, hidden, and considered again. He held it closer to the lantern, and I stepped beside him to read. The writing was Selwyn's, unmistakably, the same angular hand as the scorched letter that had summoned us to Greyfriars, but the parchment itself was torn, ripped cleanly down the middle. Only the left half remained, and even it was incomplete in thought. The words were halting, broken by pauses of visible torment. There were phrases, the sum transferred under duress. Parliamentary vote influenced through fear. My signature affixed in dread, that cast long shadows over the already murky affair Holmes had begun to reconstruct. A name had been started. Lord but the rest was gone, swallowed by the absent half. Holmes stood very still, eyes flicking across the words again and again, as though they might yet reveal something he had missed. There is no absolution here, he said finally, his voice low. Only the weight of a man crushed between what he knew and what he dared not name. I felt a chill then, not from the cold stone walls, but from the knowledge that this confession, even halved, might yet lead to ruin. Can the other half be found? I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. If it has not already been destroyed, it can. But the more pertinent question, Watson, is whether someone knew we would come looking for it. We remained in the cell for another quarter of an hour, Holmes reading the torn confession over and over with the intensity of a man who knows the truth lies not only in what is written, but in what has been left unsaid. The document, though brief, suggested a conspiracy of far greater breadth than mere financial misconduct. There is more here than bribery, Holmes said, placing the parchment upon the cot and gently weighing its corners with the Psalter's covers. The tone, note it, not one of self-justification, nor even of repentance. It is a farewell, an encrypted obituary for a man who never died. He paced once across the cell and back again. Selwyn feared this name, Lord He began to write it, then tore the paper. That act alone tells us he doubted whether he should speak it at all. You believe he was coerced? I asked. Holmes looked at me steadily. I believe he was silenced. He extinguished the lantern then, and the room returned to darkness. The pale dawn had begun to stir beyond the windows, casting faint lines across the stone floor like bars in a prison. We are not finished, Watson, Holmes said. This is not merely a confession, it is a signal, and someone, somewhere, has already seen it. We returned to our quarters at Greyfriars before dawn had fully broken. Holmes sat at the narrow writing desk. The torn confession spread once more before him beneath the dim flicker of the candle I had just relit. The edges of the document had begun to curl, and a faint smudge of soot marked the lower left corner, perhaps a remnant from the same fire that had nearly consumed the letter which first brought us here. Holmes leaned forward, drawing a steel rule from his coat and aligning it carefully against the edge of the page. With great delicacy, he measured the tear's angle and breadth, then sketched its profile in his notebook. An experienced hand tore this, he murmured. Not a gesture of panic, but of purpose, as though to divide something that must remain secret from what could safely be spoken. He tapped a line near the torn edge. Lord The pause was pregnant. Holmes did not need to speak the rest aloud. His pencil moved swiftly, and I saw the name appear in faint graphite on the page. Halbird. It struck a chord, one I had heard whispered in club corridors, always in praise and never in jest. A man of discipline, influence and ambition sharpened to a blade. Holmes looked up from the page. "Watson," he said, "we are no longer in pursuit of a disgraced solicitor. We have stepped, however lightly, upon the hem of a cabinet minister's cloak." The name stirred memories. I recalled the imposing figure of Lord Halbird from years past, his addresses in the Commons, his surgical rhetoric, his peculiar ability to halt debate not through fire, but through gravity. Though not widely beloved, he was respected by nearly all, feared by many, and known for his disdain of all things sentimental. I had seen him once in the company of foreign dignitaries, standing with his arms behind his back like a marble statue, an English Caesar amid lesser men. Holmes, as always, was ahead of me in recollection. "Halbird was once a barrister of considerable ferocity," he said. "He prosecuted half the smuggling cases on the south coast in the 60s, rose through the legal ministries with alarming speed, and became Secretary of the Treasury just as the railway scandals began to simmer." "You think he suppressed Selwyn?" I asked, Holmes's brows lifted slightly. "No, I think he used him." He stood and moved to the fire, where he stared into the dying coals for a long moment. "Selwyn was the perfect tool, respected, invisible, and accustomed to secrets. But even the finest tools wear down when they are forced to cut too deep. I believe Selwyn tried to withdraw. I believe that is when Halbird made it impossible for him to remain alive, politically, if not in truth." He turned to me then. "But the dead have an inconvenient habit of speaking after all." The following afternoon, I found myself pacing the Priory's cloister while Holmes sat at the chapel's edge in complete stillness. Though his eyes appeared fixed on the stained glass saints above the altar, I knew his thoughts were elsewhere, mapping the mind of a man he had never met. I had known men of stature in my time, soldiers, judges, clergymen, and had found in many a private morality hidden beneath the public mask. Yet Lord Halbird, from what little I recalled, struck me as one in whom public mask and private face were one and the same. He did not pretend to virtue, he simply radiated it through the quiet threat of consequence. "It is difficult to imagine such a man resorting to blackmail," I said aloud. "Difficult only if one equates blackmail with desperation," Holmes replied, rising from the bench. "There is a form of coercion, Watson, that masquerades as policy. One need not whisper in alleyways to orchestrate a fall from grace. A single phrase in the right corridor, a delay in a vote, a correction in a memorandum, these are the instruments of a different kind of villainy. And yet," I said, "he remains untouchable." Holmes's expression did not change, but his voice carried a note I rarely heard, the steel edge of moral resolve, until someone chooses not to be afraid. That evening, as a hard frost began to settle over the Priory's cloisters, Holmes prepared his satchel with unusual care. He did not speak for some time, and I watched him from the corner of the room, knowing better than to interrupt the mechanism in motion. When at last he closed the bag and reached for his overcoat, I asked quietly, "Do you mean to confront him?" "I do," he said without turning. "But not as an accuser, not yet." "Then as what?" "As a mirror," Holmes replied. "Let us see if Lord Halbird recognises his reflection." He paused before the hearth, where the torn confession still lay beneath a paperweight. "There is no path forward that does not place us in danger," he continued. "Should Halbird feel threatened, he will not respond with panic, but with precision. He will move pieces we cannot see, and he will do so with elegance and efficiency. That is the sort of man he is." "And yet you go," I said. Holmes met my gaze. "Because if Selwyn's truth remains hidden, then what becomes of all our deductions, Watson? They are merely echoes in a chamber designed to swallow sound." He extinguished the lamp and drew on his gloves. "Come, it is time we met the man the confession feared." 2 days later, we found ourselves in the heart of Belgravia, the afternoon air brittle with frost and the streets hushed by that curious silence, particular to the quarters of the powerful. It was here, behind the polished facades of quiet grandeur, that men such as Lord Halbird moved their pieces across the board of empire. Holmes, whose instinct for theatrical understatement rivaled his capacity for deduction, had arranged our audience through the simple expedient of invoking an imaginary foundation devoted to clerical education. He had written, in impeccable prose, a request for brief counsel from the Right Honourable Lord Halbird regarding his former support of rural charities and the redirection of ecclesiastical endowments. The language was vague enough to pass unquestioned, yet precise enough to appeal to the minister's vanity. "Halbird does not entertain inquiries," Holmes had remarked as we dressed that morning. "He permits them, so long as they pose no visible threat to the structures he has built." We arrived at precisely 4 o'clock. The butler who admitted us was a man of such discreet bearing that I might have mistaken him for a visiting bishop had he worn the collar. He led us through a high-ceilinged vestibule, past portraits of formidable ancestors, and into a drawing-room whose precise arrangement bespoke not domesticity, but deliberate stagecraft. "Watson," Holmes murmured, "when one steps into a cage lined with velvet, it is wise to recall that it may yet hold a tiger." The room into which we were received was almost ostentatiously refined. There was not a speck of dust, not a book out of alignment, not a poker out of place beside the fireplace. The afternoon sun caught upon polished mahogany and the crystal of an untouched decanter, its rays diffused by ivory drapes that had been arranged, one could only say orchestrated, to admit the light and none of the heat. A clock ticked with judicial regularity upon the mantelpiece. There was no scent of food, tobacco, or humanity. Lord Halbird entered with the grace of a man who has never needed to hurry. He was tall, lean, and immaculately dressed in a dark suit of sober cut. His silvered hair was precisely parted, his gaze direct but unreadable. His manner exuded the kind of dignity cultivated not by accident of birth alone, but by decades of calculated restraint. "Mr. Holmes," he said, offering a hand that was warm, firm, and free of tremor. "Doctor, I confess your letter was a curiosity, but I pride myself on the habit of courtesy." Holmes inclined his head, accepting the handshake with the faintest of bows. "We are grateful for your time, my lord. Our work, as mentioned, touches on the intersection of legal endowments and monastic institutions. I understand you were once a great supporter of such causes." Halbird's smile was as elegant as it was empty. "A matter of public duty, not personal sentiment." As he gestured for us to sit, I noted how his fingers rested lightly upon the back of the chair, never gripping, never resting, like a man accustomed to command without contact. Holmes spoke for some time in the measured cadences of academic inquiry, asking after various pieces of legislation from a decade past, their impact on religious exemptions, the allocation of private trusts. Lord Halbird answered each question with a composure that bordered on indifference, his voice modulated to perfection, his gaze unwavering. Then Holmes, with no change in tone, no pause of rhythm, dropped a name into the conversation like a stone into still water. "Would you happen to recall a man named Arthur Selwyn?" For the space of a breath nothing changed, and then, so faint that only a student of Holmes's training, or perhaps mine, would have noticed it, Halbird's right eye twitched. It was not the flinch of guilt. It was smaller, sharper, a tightening of restraint, a muscle suppressed too quickly. "I do not believe I am acquainted with the name," he replied, eyes steady once more. "Curious," Holmes said, with a smile that meant precisely nothing. He was a solicitor of some reputation in the late 70s, associated with several clients in the freight charter disputes. "Ah," Halbird said, "that era was politically complex." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and yet some names seem to persist in the margins of history, even when struck from the record." For a moment, Lord Halbird's gaze moved to the decanter as though weighing whether to pour himself a drink. Then he turned his eyes back to Holmes and said, "I find the past is best served when left unsentimental." We left the house as the hour turned, the chill deepening across the stone avenues of Belgravia. The sky had grown hard and colourless above the rooftops, and a fine powder of frost had begun to gather upon the window panes of the houses we passed. Holmes said nothing for nearly 2 streets. His hands were deep in his pockets, his head slightly bowed, and I knew better than to speak until the inner wheels had settled. At last he said, "Did you note the twitch, Watson?" "I did. And the deliberate misdirection. He did not deny Selwyn's existence. He reframed the era. He wishes the whole affair to remain buried." Holmes gave a short nod, and not for fear of legal consequence. "No, Lord Halbird plays on a higher board. His fear is legacy. His concern is for the edifice he has constructed, not the bodies it rests upon." We turned into a quieter square, and he halted for a moment beneath the wrought iron lamplight. He is not afraid of the truth. He is afraid of its echo. I said nothing. The wind bit at the corner of my scarf, and the shadows from the lamp curled like ink upon the pavement. Holmes's eyes were fixed ahead. "We must return to Greyfriars. There is more to find, and I do not believe Selwyn left us all that he intended." Holmes returned to Greyfriars alone. I followed the next morning on the earliest train, summoned by a brief telegram bearing only 6 words. "Bring gloves. South Chapel. No delay." When I arrived, the Priory was steeped in an eerie calm, the sort that comes not from peace but from something being held still. A pale mist clung to the cloisters like gauze, and the stones beneath my feet felt colder than usual. I found Holmes seated in the south transept of the chapel, not in prayer, but in perfect stillness. The stone altar loomed before him, stained by centuries of candle wax and time. He did not look up as I approached, but spoke in that low, flat tone which always signified the imminence of revelation. "I have examined every inch of this chapel, Watson, every flagstone, every votive niche, every inscription softened by time. But it is not what one sees in plain sight that matters. It is what remains when all else has been stripped away." He rose then, slowly, and stepped toward the altar. His hand brushed the carved base of the reredos, pausing at a corner where the chisel marks broke ever so slightly from their symmetrical rhythm. "You see, the monks sealed away more than secrets in this house," he said. "They sealed history, and Selwyn, brother Caleb, hid his truth where no man of this world would dare disturb it." With his left hand gloved and steady, Holmes reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew a narrow-bladed chisel and a leather-wrapped mallet. He positioned them with the care of a surgeon preparing for incision. "This altar," he said, "was repaired sometime after 1878. Note the variation in lichen and wear on this eastern edge. The mortar is newer than its neighbours and of a slightly coarser grain." He struck once gently, and a line of dust bloomed from the crack like breath in cold air. Another tap, then another, and at last a faint hollow note, a change in timbre that only Holmes could have discerned. He slid his chisel beneath the edge and pried it upward with exquisite care. A panel, thin and ancient, came loose with the sigh of disturbed time. Behind it lay a narrow recess in the stone, dark, dry, and untouched. Holmes reached within and drew out a bundle wrapped in linen, browned with age but bound still with twine. The shape was unmistakably that of folded parchment. He carried it reverently to the small bench behind the altar and unwrapped the package as one might unfold a dying man's final words. Inside were 7 leaves of vellum, covered in a tight, deliberate hand. The seal of a notary marked the last page. He held them in silence for a moment. "Not the shadow," he murmured, "the whole of it." By candlelight in the guest quarters, we read it together. The confession of Arthur Selwyn was not dramatic. It bore none of the emotional flourishes or desperate justifications one might expect from a man unburdening himself in the face of death. It was plain, cold, and methodical. An anatomy of complicity. He named the dates and places, the secret sessions with intermediaries from the Treasury, the veiled threats against his family should he choose to speak. The payments funneled through legal retainers and fictitious charities. He detailed the mechanism of parliamentary influence, how votes were secured not with money, but with promises to delay audits, protect pensions, or disappear inconvenient inquiries. And, at the centre of it all, his superior, his coercer, the man who had engineered the network and silenced its victims, was Lord Halbird. He did not need to say, "Do this or perish," Selwyn wrote. He merely made it clear that to disobey would mean ruin, and that ruin would not stop with me. The confession concluded not with a plea for forgiveness, but with an invocation. "I ask no mercy of men," it read, "but I ask that truth be allowed, if not to triumph, then at least to exist, if only in secret." We sat in silence when the final word had been read. Holmes had not touched his pipe, nor once reached for a pencil. He merely stared at the pages, as though they were a mirror in which he had glimpsed something irrevocable. I do not mind confessing that I found myself shaken by the scope of what we had uncovered, not merely because of the names involved, or the scale of corruption, though both were immense, but because of the particular form the evil had taken. There was no blood, no dagger, no villain in black cape or mask, only decisions, made in rooms like this one, by men who never raised their voices. Holmes sat with his hands resting loosely on his knees, the firelight playing across the angles of his face. "You will not take this to Lestrade?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He did not look at me as he spoke. "Lestrade cannot prosecute legacy, Watson, nor can he prosecute a system that shields itself with silence. Were I to deliver this to Scotland Yard, it would vanish before it saw a courtroom, or worse, it would be used as currency by those who understand how to barter in secrets." He turned to the window, where the candlelight met the frost. "No," he said, "this truth cannot live in public, but it must live somewhere." I felt the weight of it then, not just the document, but what it meant to carry knowledge too dangerous for daylight. Holmes's burden was not one of pride, but of stewardship. "We shall give it to someone," he added, "who has a right to mourn." The next morning, I found Holmes seated at the table in our Baker Street sitting room, his movements slow, precise, and uncommonly deliberate. The confession lay before him, folded carefully and bound with a single strand of cotton twine. Beside it sat a plain brown envelope, no seal, no name, no address. The fire was low in the grate, and the room carried the quiet of a place emptied of speculation. He slipped the vellum leaves inside the envelope without a word, smoothing its edges and tucking down the flap. "You are not sending it to the Yard?" I asked. "No." "To the press?" "Certainly not." He reached for his gloves, pausing only to glance at the clock. "There is a woman in Bayswater," he said. "Her name is Elaine Weatherby. She was born Elaine Selwyn. She has no memory of her father, only the faintest recollection of a name spoken in bitterness and buried beneath silence." "And you mean to give this to her?" Holmes nodded, donning his coat. "She has a right to the truth, Watson, not because it will grant her peace, but because she has carried a wound without knowing its cause. She deserves at least to choose whether to forgive it." We left the house without further discussion, the envelope secure in Holmes's inner coat pocket. The morning was crisp, the fog lifting in pale sheets along Churchilmer and Oxford Street, and though I knew we were walking toward revelation, there was nothing triumphant in Holmes' gait, only a restrained gravity, as though he bore an urn, not a document. The address was a modest brick house, just beyond Paddington, its front steps worn smooth and a climbing vine curling around the iron rail. A lace curtain stirred behind one of the upper windows as we approached, and when Holmes rang the bell, we were answered by a maid in a grey dress and white apron, who, upon seeing the card Holmes passed her, raised her eyebrows and vanished without a word. Moments later, a woman of perhaps 35 appeared in the narrow hallway. Her figure was slim, her posture exact, and her clothing tasteful but not fashionable, chosen for restraint rather than display. She studied us both with cool civility. "I am Mrs. Weatherby," she said. "You wrote nothing in your note, Mr. Holmes. What matter brings you here?" Holmes gave a slight bow. "A matter of the past, madam. Concerning a man who once went by the name of Arthur Selwyn." She blinked once, almost imperceptibly, but said nothing. Holmes continued, his voice gentle but unflinching. "You may know him only as a shadow, perhaps as a disgrace, or a silence too long unexplained. But he was your father." Mrs. Weatherby's face remained composed, but her breath caught just slightly, and her hand moved to the side of her waist as though to steady herself. "You had best come in," she said, her voice low. "My husband is at work. The children are at school." We stepped into a parlour of simple taste, where nothing had been placed for ornament. Holmes withdrew the envelope from his coat and placed it upon the small table between us. "I offer no interpretation," he said. "Only the words of a man who feared he could not return." Elaine Weatherby sat for some time without touching the envelope. Her gaze hovered just above it, as though expecting it to breathe. When at last she did reach for it, her hands were steady, but the movement had the quality of a woman lifting something fragile from the wreckage of memory. She unfolded the pages with slow precision and began to read. Holmes and I remained seated in silence. The clock ticked softly on the mantel. A carriage passed along the street and was gone. Outside, a sparrow tapped briefly at the glass before flying off, unnoticed. She read the confession without interruption, her eyes scanning line by line with the intensity of one reconstructing a face from a long-lost sketch. She did not weep, nor did she speak, but a transformation took place in her posture. Her back straightened, then softened. Her lips, tightly drawn at the outset, parted slightly, perhaps to breathe more deeply, or perhaps in recognition. Halfway through the final page, her fingers tightened slightly, creasing the vellum's corner. At last, when she had read the final line, she placed the pages down before her and looked at Holmes. "Why now?" "Because," he replied. Now was the first time someone wished to listen. She stared at the confession a moment longer. "I was told he drowned," she said quietly. "My mother never spoke of it. I remember hearing the word coward. I think I was 6. She folded the papers again, gently, and drew them close. "I wish I hated him," she said. "But now I think I never truly knew what to feel." She turned toward the Holmes with a question poised on the brink of her lips, one that seemed to require no breath to form. "Will others know?" she asked. "Will this come to light?" Holmes held her gaze with a curious softness, one I had seen only a handful of times in our long acquaintance. His voice was quiet, grave, and sure. "No, not unless you choose it." "But you could expose him. Halbird, the others. You could shake the halls of Parliament." "I could," Holmes said. "But justice, Mrs. Weatherby, is not always served by fire. Sometimes it is better served by keeping the ashes safe." Her lips pressed together, and she looked away, toward the window, the light, the world outside. Then she nodded once. "My children will never know that name, but I will." Holmes inclined his head. "Then your father has already found more peace in death than he ever earned in life." As we stood to leave, she stopped us. "I thank you, not for justice, not even for truth, but for allowing me to grieve something real." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the bare branches along the pavement. Holmes and I walked in silence for some time. Then, as we crossed the canal bridge toward Marylebone, I ventured a glance at him. "You carried her sorrow," I said. "No, Watson," he replied, his gaze fixed ahead. "I simply returned what belonged to her." The morning I returned to Baker Street, the snow had fallen in a thin, uncompromising sheet across the rooftops, softening the angles of chimneys and gables until London resembled a city drawn in charcoal and frost. The sound of hooves along Baker Street was muffled, and the air bore that clean, metallic scent peculiar to a city stilled by cold. Mrs. Hudson admitted me with a nod, her eyes betraying neither question nor surprise. I found Holmes precisely where I expected, seated in his armchair by the fire, one long leg crossed over the other, the tips of his fingers pressed together in a steeple beneath his chin. The Persian slipper still hung on the mantel, and the pipe rack stood untouched, though the air bore a faint residue of tobacco that suggested long reflection. He did not look up as I entered, but I saw his eyes were fixed not on the hearth, but on the small wooden box upon the side table. Selwyn's torn half-confession, bound again in twine, and untouched since the day we delivered the full truth into gentler hands. I said nothing, merely lowered myself into the chair opposite and waited, as I had learned to do. For some minutes only the sound of the fire spoke between us. Then Holmes stirred at last, his voice low and level. "The world has not changed, Watson, but it may now remember, quietly, that someone once wished it to." He leaned forward and touched a coal hook to the fire, stirring the embers to a brighter glow. "Selwyn," he said softly, as if speaking the name for the first time. "A man who chose silence not for cowardice, but for control." I raised an eyebrow. "He did not vanish because he feared prison," Holmes continued. "He vanished because he understood that some punishments, when administered publicly, become weapons for the very men who ought to be judged. Halbird would have survived a scandal. Others would have fallen. But Selwyn, he ensured the wound bled inward." "He spared them," I said. "He spared the nation," Holmes corrected, "and his daughter." I sat back, considering the full weight of that. In our profession, mine as physician, his as investigator, we had seen a wide spectrum of human resolve, but it was rare to encounter a man who had accepted disgrace as a safeguard. "You do not believe him guilty?" "I believe him flawed," Holmes replied, "but not corrupt. Guilt, in its deepest form, is not the result of action. It is the knowledge of having failed one's own standard. He could not undo what had been done, but he could vanish, and thereby deny his silence to those who would have profited by it." He paused. "Few men understand how to disappear, Watson. Fewer still choose it over survival. Selwyn's was a punishment chosen rather than earned. That makes him neither villain nor martyr, but something rarer, a man who understood the cost of legacy." Holmes rose then and crossed to the window, gazing out across the rooftops. His silhouette, dark against the grey morning, was motionless save for the faintest stir of his dressing gown at the ankle. "Have you ever considered," he said without turning, "whether the truth must always be pursued?" I was taken aback by the question. "Surely, Holmes, truth is your very occupation." "Indeed, but occupations, like all instruments, may be wielded too sharply." He turned now, his eyes fixed on mine. "We uncovered Selwyn's confession. We followed it to its conclusion. And yet, Watson, I find myself wondering, not for the first time, whether we have done what is right or merely what is possible." "You mean," I began. "We could have exposed Halbird and made a spectacle of a system already rotting in its own discretion," Holmes replied. "We could have cast a light so bright it blinded the innocent with the guilty. Instead, we gave the truth to the one person who had the right to weigh it." He moved to the table and placed a hand upon the box. "Some truths, when spoken aloud, do not liberate. They ignite. Better, sometimes, that they remain as embers, warm to the few who need them, harmless to the many who do not." I could not help but nod. For Holmes to speak thus was rare, not because he lacked principle, but because he understood too well the shadows that principle may cast. And in that moment, I realized that truth, in his hands, was not a weapon, but a scalpel. Holmes reached down and removed the last scrap of Selwyn's torn confession, the one we had found in the Psalter, the one that bore only half a name and half a sin. He held it between thumb and forefinger, then extended it toward the fire, where it curled slowly in the flame. The parchment blackened at the edges, blistered, and vanished with a faint hiss. No flourish, no declaration, only the release of one final ghost. He watched it burn with no change in his expression. "There," he said softly, Let the record show what it never held. Outside, the snow had begun again, falling with the calmness of things resigned to their cycle. The rooftops disappeared anew beneath the white, and the sound of the street diminished until the room felt suspended in time. I did not speak. I merely watched my friend, a man of unmatched intellect and unfathomable restraint, bear the weight of yet another truth he could never claim and would never need to. When at last Holmes turned from the hearth, he looked not to me, but to the window. "History will not mark him," he said, "nor will it remember us. But somewhere, in a small house in Bayswater, a woman sits with the knowledge her father wished to leave behind. That, Watson, is enough." He returned to his chair and picked up the violin resting nearby. The first note he drew was long, minor, and full of winter, and as the snow thickened, I sat back in silence, warmed not by victory, but by something more rare and more human, the quiet dignity of a truth buried not to deceive, but to protect. As we stepped out into the pale hush of the evening, a gentle snow beginning to fall over Bayswater's quiet streets, Holmes adjusted his collar and said, "There is no greater burden than a truth too long buried, Watson. It ferments, changes shape, and finally emerges not as justice, but as legacy, inherited, not chosen." I walked beside him in silence, the weight of Elaine Selwyn's unreadable expression still lingering in my thoughts. Holmes continued, "The law may pursue guilt, but it is the heart that endures consequence. Sometimes the question is not who sinned, but who paid. What do you think? Was Arthur Selwyn truly seeking redemption, or merely trying to shift the guilt he could no longer carry? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this mystery, subscribe for more Holmes cases, and pass the story along to those who love the delicate art of deduction.